Well, our study today is around the topic sex, commitment, and responsibility. And it seems like a heavy subject. We're not going to make it heavy. And in reality, we are going to invite all of you to probe deeper into some of the books that we studied, specifically the book In the Greater World, which has an entire chapter that is going to talk about some of the things that we're going to mention here. And while we don't propose to know everything regarding this topic, because we are all students as far as all of this is concerned, we always like to repeat there is always psychologists, psychiatrists, people who specialize in assisting us if we find that we are in need of guidance as far as any of these topics here are concerned. And in reality, we were invited to do this topic at another Spiritist center, envisioning the youth, envisioning talking to young adults and teenagers, and bringing the notion around the topic, the responsibility that entails all of these three items right here. We would like to begin with a phrase that is found in the book Our Daily Bread, which is explained by Emmanuel, in which he addresses the Romans in stating, "I know and am certain in the Lord Jesus that nothing is unclean in itself except to the one who regards it as such." Now, for those who study about this letter that was addressed to the Romans, we know that Paul was addressing the issue that at that time represented a bitter dispute between the Gentiles and the Jews, and it had to do with food. Nowadays, he says, we can bring this very same sentence and apply it towards other areas of life that has been misunderstood. So he begins the message in saying, let us take sex, for instance. Since our topic is about this, the message from Our Daily Bread is pretty profound. Andreia Lewis, when he talks about sex, the act of sex, he states that within our sexual activity, the uncleanliness is not in the act itself, but in the conduct of our own minds. It's pretty interesting that we stick to this because people have this idea, well, let's bring us here. Who here had a parent who sat down and talked about sex openly without any kind of taboos or blushing or issues or difficulties? You had a parent that did that? Good for you. Denise, good. Anyone else? Marcelo and Elcio. I would guess that the others that didn't raise their hands are in the same boat I am. My father did not know how to talk openly to sex with me. Maybe it had to do with the fact that I was a girl. Maybe it had to do with the fact of how he was brought up. But I had questions. As a teenager, you have questions. You start dating and you go through your own experiences. You find out who you are. You find out what the conduct is. You find out what your preferences are. But you also have doubts. As you discover yourself and you go from experience to experience, whether it's a sexual experience or that of an intimacy or just a dating, a lot of questions arise. So when Andreia Lewis states that the act itself is not unclean, but the conduct of our own mind, it's pretty important that we realize this. Because we are not going to talk about any Puritan aspect here. We're going to talk about this subject today openly in light of the Spiritist teaching. He continues, no other area of earthly activity has suffered greater defamation. Who agrees? You agree, right? Some couples are not even able to talk about sex between the two of them without feeling like it's a touchy thing. And then we question, are they not comfortable with it because of themselves, from not knowing exactly what it is that they need? Are they applying this characteristics of defamation towards the act itself? Emmanuel state that we can attribute many things to how we see the defamation of this act. According to Emmanuel, since we are still fundamentally blind of spirit, as we are evolving, as we are progressing, as our vision about life and all of the other aspects broaden, he says, we haven't not yet managed to discovering sex one of the most sublime reasons for our existence. If we talk about the aspect of defamation, but then he brings it back and says that we, since we haven't evolved yet enough to discovering sex, one of the most sublime reasons for our existence, he brings us examples. He says, the most exquisite achievements in the planetary realm, such as the uniting of souls for motherhood and fatherhood, the creation and the reproduction of bodies, the extension of life and the precious stimuli for work and regeneration have been provided by the Lord to His creatures by means of sexual emotions. He's not only talking about the physical aspect of it, he's bringing us notion about sexual emotions. However, humans have desecrated this holy place, populating its altars with the ghosts of licentiousness. From this alone, we can have a broader understanding about the notion of responsibility about the topic. Not only a spiritual responsibility, since he's talking about sexual emotions, but also that of physical responsibility. Sex established the home and created the name mother, but human, in their selfishness, exchanged it for absurd animalistic experiences, thereby generating cruel trials for themselves. When he talks about this, I started reflecting about some of these painful and cruel trials that could come from this. We can only take a look at our society. Rape is one of the aspects that they're talking about. They're talking about dissolution of marriage from people who give in to their impulses. People who are not aware that perhaps there is something that is not worked within themselves in the area of sexual activity, which they bring about certain ills and vices and situations in which they end up hurting themselves. So let's take this article that I read on the Huffington Post. This woman is 43 years old. We're not here to judge anybody, but I really love the article because she brought in something about her frailties. She said that when she was a young girl, she was talked about family and building a family and being married and having somebody who would share in her life. She would marry well. She would marry someone who also had the same kind of aspiration in the professional field. And then she would have children. All of this happened by the time she was 26. So she was leading the life that she had hoped for. Well, life came. And with life, the difficulties and the hardship that started happening, not only on the workforce, but also between her and her husband. Because one of the things that she said they lacked was intimacy. But then I question, how can you have sex without intimacy? Right, Sherry? Because one of the things that she said is, anybody can have sex. Try building intimacy. That which allows you to speak to your partner and show them your sensitive and frail side, and also accept that of your partner. She started to get a little bit restless by the time she got in her 30s. And temptations started arising, calling her attention to other beings. Feeling unsatisfied and not knowing how to express it, she decided at the age of 43 to divorce. So she says, I am at a phase in my life right now where we're not condoning divorce, by the way, just citing an example. She said, I am 44 or 45, and I have come to realize that the saying, the grass is always greener on the other side, is not true. So she went to the cliche slogan in saying, the grass is greener where you water it. Because the aspect of relationship is something that we have to take care of it every single day. Sherry has been married for 15 years. Is that right? Today's your anniversary?
Yeah.
Okay. Happy everyday married life. And while she has been married for 15 years, and Marcelo and I have been married for 4, and Marcelo and Carla might have been married for 7, 6, what we all can agree on and others that I may not know here, is that relationship takes work. And it takes a lot of commitment as well. And without responsibility, commitment, if you don't have love to back all that up, it's going to be impossible to maintain it. And that's something that we decided to bring this example by this woman because she was so raw and open about what she was talking about. She said, if I had only talked to my husband and sought assistance to be able to verbalize what it is that I needed, perhaps I wouldn't be in this situation. Because finding a meaningful partner nowadays is something really hard to do. We continue. Without sounding like a Puritan, we're going to talk about love and sex as this holy notion of divinity that Emmanuel talks about. Understanding the holy notion about a creative force, as he stated. To back it up, we went to a doctor called Dr. Jorge Andreia. He's in Brazil, he's in his 90s, and he wrote a book called The Sexual Forces of the Soul. He says, we understand the worth of sexual energies and its infinite horizons transfused and incorporated within cosmic reason. It's pretty powerful how he begins. How far men and women still have to go in order to consciously participate in the transcendental mechanism of this creative force. How far we still have to consciously participate, how far we have to go to consciously, to be aware, participating in this transcendental mechanism of the creative force. Sex will no longer be studied or understood only within its peripheral manifestations in the physical organization of the being, but also in depth as a creative source. And here it's pretty amazing because it continues and he says, the sexual potential of the soul can be erotic, but in the intimacy of its forces, everything that represents the essence of life, like knowledge, virtues of the immortal spirit, that's us, incarnate or not, and the pathway towards its perfection and integral love is found. I don't know if you guys truly understood what we just said here, but he's bringing us a pretty profound idea on the aspect of sex as a creative force. We are going to resort to the book In the Greater World just to read a little bit here, because what he's talking about is as we evolve, as we progress spiritually and our mind broadens, a deeper understanding about the perception of the creative force is going to be understood. We understand that we are in a world right now where we are in the matter. We have the physical organization. Not only do we have our sex, I am a female, Marcelo is a male, but we also have the act itself, that which is sublime. Remember what he said, it's not the act itself that is unclean, but the conduct of our own mind. In the book, In the Greater World, as we talk about evolving, here's what Andreia Lewis had to say. The patient work of millennia, it's not Andreia Lewis, I apologize, it's the spirit guide. The patient work of millennia has transformed relationships. Woman-mother, man-father gave rise to a new breath of renewal to the spirit. Based on sexual experiences, the tribe became the family. The hut metamorphosed into the home. Armed defense gave way to jurisprudence. The wild forest was transformed into the peaceful farm. He's talking about the evolution of how everything began, when the tribes and going into the society. The heterogeneous character of huge expanses of territory opened the way to the communion of ideals in a progressive homeland. Barbarism rose to civilization. The crude process of physical attraction were transubstantiated into artistic aspiration that dignified the individual, and grunts were elevated to melody. Stimulated by the creative power of sex, the human community is advancing, albeit slowly, he says, toward the supreme goal of divine love. From the spontaneous, brutal manifestation of the less elevated senses, the soul is traveling towards its glorious initiation. Then, he brings the various aspects of sexual force. He says, desire, ownership, affinity, fondness, devotion, selflessness, and sacrifice constitute aspects of the sublime journey as we evolve within our own sexual forces. When we see it this way, it changes a little bit on how we perceive the act itself. But then he continues, and I close the book. He continues, the construction of true happiness does not depend on satisfying the instinct, the sexual instinct. Whereas what Emmanuel talked about, how we give in to these impulses and every type of trials is created by our misconduct in giving into the instinct, in giving into the impulses. He said the exchange of sexual cells among incarnate beings, guaranteeing the continuity of physical forms in the evolutionary process, is but only one aspect of the multiform exchanges of love. It is important to realize that the exchange of harmonious energies of combined spiritual fluids, of attuned vibration between two souls who love each other, soar above any tangible exteriorization of affection, sustaining imperishable works of life and light in the unlimited spheres of the universe. So he brings us back talking about what happens when two people who love each other get together, not only for the aspect of creating beings, of a woman becoming pregnant, but actually giving in to one another, making love. The exchange of spiritual fluids that happens, which in reality, we are going to be told as we apply this creative force as nourishment for the spirits. There are countless books that talks about what happens when a couple who love each other, who are committed to one another, who are there knowing about the responsibility that entails maintaining that relationship. What happens in the bedroom when they consume and when they make love? They say that there is a protection, a barrier, something that is done with respect for the two human beings that are nourishing one another by the use of the spiritual fluids. But then they talk about those who give into the impulses without any kind of feeling, without any kind of commitment, without any kind of responsibility, whereas our spiritual body becomes impregnated with toxins. Cells that actually may allow later on in life illnesses. People are not aware of what happens when two people get together and they have sex, what in reality they're exchanging. If there is no love, if there is no commitment, if there is no notion of responsibility around it, what we are doing in reality is putting our own body in compromise. Because whatever gets impregnated in our spiritual body is going to reflect in the physical body. We're not just talking about STDs. We're not just talking about sexually transmitted diseases. We're talking about something much more profound. Emotions. How many people we see that go from one relationship to the other seeking for love, and by the time they get to a certain age, their 30s, they look like they're 60. They're drawn. Nothing. They didn't get feed. There was no exchange. We talked about this phrase yesterday. In love, there is a giver, there is a receiver. And in a loving, committed relationship, each one is the giver and each one is the receiver. But if we're talking about the creative force, we are going to mention some people who didn't usually actually utilize sex in their life. We can resort to St. Francis of Assisi. We can resort to Mother Teresa. We can resort to any of those saints that we so admire. So my question to you guys is, because they didn't have sex, did that consider them to be more evolved beings? No? No? Depending on the feeling?
Yeah.
So this is really...
behind of why they don't having sex, what the intention behind?
Well, if we look at sex as they have been explained to us as a creative force, a creative energy, the only thing they did differently is they applied it towards service. It's really interesting to see this. If we read biographies of St. Francis of Assisi and other people, and we see that they're in constant work of charity, they are putting that energy, that force, that drive of being of service for someone else. And here's where we have a hard understanding of this. You know, people, are they asexual? Do they not have any feelings? What about their organic composition, right? So Divaldo Franco, who is a world-renowned medium, shares with us a story about when he was 21 years old, a young man, full of energy, you know, full of energy. And he didn't know what to do with that, and it was tormenting him because ideas would pop in his mind, and he didn't know who to talk to because he came from a very strong Catholic background, and talking about sex was taboo. God forbid we just say the word, it was immoral. You couldn't talk about it. So he met none other than Francisco Cândido Xavier, the greater medium of the century. And Francisco Cândido Xavier was older than him, therefore more experienced. He was invited to go to his house, and Divaldo, I think I shared this with you guys, so I'm sorry for those who were here on Wednesday. He didn't know what to say, and he was there eating with Divaldo, with Chico Xavier. And Chico Xavier, out of nowhere, noticing what was going on in Divaldo's mind, started talking about how everything in nature is sex, a creative force. He says when the roots of a tree penetrates deep into the soil, finding their nourishment to sustain itself and provide shadow for human beings, it's applying in its own evolutionary process a sexual force, a creative force. And Divaldo was like, oh my God, he can see what I'm thinking, right? So later on, they decide to take a walk after everybody had left, and Chico Xavier looks at Divaldo and he says, do you have any questions for me? And he's like, well, no. So Chico, respecting him and understanding his position, very shy, very naive, started explaining to him other aspects in nature where we can find the creative force. But then he said, Divaldo, when I went through the process that you are going through, I learned how to apply that sexual energy and directive to serve as a creative force. He said, I don't have biological children, but I apply this force within myself towards my biological spiritual children, which are the books. Now, Chico Xavier as a medium, if we can try to understand this, he felt even more this creative force. And to try to educate it, because his commitment was other than that of building a family and doing the things that we do, he actually decided to apply it, educating his own cells and talking to his own body. But he said, you know, I spent 12 hours of uninterrupted work channeling, because Chico Xavier wrote over 460 books, which is amazing. So 12 hours of uninterrupted channeling work, channeling the spirits, bringing the books that today give us so much knowledge. He needed the energy to do that. Nobody normal would do that without the creative force being applied towards that. And he taught Divaldo to do the same thing. So one day, Chico Xavier was feeling so sad because he had run into a friend that he hadn't seen in over 20 years. And the friend comes to Uberaba and he says, Chico, look at you. You haven't made any progress. This is what the guy is telling Chico Xavier. He said, look at me. I have 3 houses on the beach. I have a good job. I have gotten married and have 2 kids, and I already have grandchildren. And look at you. What have you done? Chico Xavier went home really sad. When he gets there, who's at the doorstep waiting for him? Emmanuel, his spirit guide. He says, Chico, why are you so sad? He said, look at me. I'm a trap. I haven't done anything good in my life. He's like, what are you talking about? He said, look where I live. He says, yes, you have a home, you have a comfortable bed, you have plenty to eat. He said, yeah, but you don't understand. I don't have any jobs. My friend is a doctor. He's like, yeah, well, through your mediumship, you have channeled over many amazing doctors. More privileged than he is. He said, yeah, I understand all that, but he is married. He said, so are you. You're married to the cause, that which you came with the obligation to do, and you know of your commitment. He said, but you don't understand. I don't have any kids. He said, you have hundreds of children. And not just that, you have grandchildren. He said, how is it that I have grandchildren? He said, your books are being translated. So you have grandchildren. And pretty soon, you're going to have great-grandchildren. And he didn't understand. He said, the great-grandchildren will be those who will read your books, become illuminated by them, broaden their conscience, thus becoming more spiritualized. And I thought that was so fantastic, because in every aspect of life, if we look at the spirit as immortal beings here, going through an experience, even though they're in the physical body, there are many ways in which one can become productive. When we talk about everything that we are talking about here, we are going to see that there is one person who sticks in the history that actually received a bad name by the way she led her lifestyle. Prostitution, right? But she was chosen. She was the one who had a complete turnaround in her life once she understood the aspect and notion and responsibility. But not just that, she was thirsting for love. She wanted to know what else she could do in her life. And of course, we're talking about Mary of Magdalene here, the one referenced in the Bible that talks so deeply about this that we're talking about today. And we are not going to repeat her story today, but we are actually going to use her as an example to narrate what we are trying to do as far as sex commitment and responsibility is concerned. I'm going to skip this slide here because we have kind of already touched bases on it, and get to Mary of Magdalene. And I'm going to ask you to excuse me here because I have to get a book that is called Sex and Consciousness by Divaldo Franco, in which he narrates a story. He narrates a pretty profound experience that he had in the beginning phases of his work as a speaker. He went to a country in Latin America outside of Brazil, and after he finished his talk about Mary of Magdalene, explaining all of her reasonings for getting to where she did, I'm going to share this part of the story because a lot of people don't know. A lot of people only know Mary as the one who sold illusions, and then she had a mega transformation. She sold everything she had, and then she became dedicated to the cause. But then there was a Mary before Mary of Magdalene. Because Divaldo Franco, through the mediumship and the spirit Amelia Rodriguez, narrates that Mary of Magdalene was actually sold as a slave in her young age. She lost her parents, so she was sold as a slave, and as a slave she did the things that were requested of her. But she fell in love with one man who used her, and he made very little cause of her. He pretty much used her, abused her, and when he was done, he threw her away. And her anguish and her hurt was so profound that she decided to lead the lifestyle that we have all learned about, because she became rich, she had her own home, she had all the silk, all the jewelry, and many men competed for a night with her. But she was pretty empty on the inside. Because one of the things that we do when we see people that have some kind of lifestyle that is questionable, we're very good at doing that, we never question what brought them to the point of where they are and why they're doing the things they are. Because in the exterior, everything seems clear to us, but we don't know what's inside their mind and the history and what brought them to where they were. Regardless, Divaldo Franco narrates the story that he's there in this Latin America country. And after the lecture, there was a long line of people, as there always is, to see Divaldo. And he was signing the book. This woman approached him, and he looked at her, and something about her caught his attention. And she said, "Do you have a minute to talk to me?" And he said, "Yes, I have 10 minutes. She said, "I need more than 10 minutes. And he said that when he looked at her, he thought, this woman could be my daughter. She was really young. She said, "Before I came to watch you do your lecture," which, by the way, I didn't understand anything. That's what she said, because she had never heard of Spiritism. She said, "There was only one part of your lecture which I really loved, which is the one that you talked about Mary of Magdalene, because I am her." She says, "Before I came here to see you, I was at a cafe, and I was contemplating committing suicide tonight. to show them the vial of what she was going to take. But then I heard these two women talking about spiritism and about this man from Bahia who was going to come and do a talk, and how he talked about reincarnation, and how he talked about a divine justice, and how he talked about God, and how he talked about the many chances that we're given in life. And something really talked to my heart, and I decided that maybe, just maybe, I could kill myself later and come and watch you tonight. Givaldo noticed that it was a very serious conversation that was about to happen. He said, listen, I can't talk to you right now because I have another engagement in an hour. But if you come to the house where I'm staying, it's Judge so-and-so. He was at someone's house who had a very high position in society. He said, we can talk. She said, I can't go to his house. He said, why not? She said, well, I sell illusions for a living. And Givaldo looked at her. She said, I'm given many names. I'm either woman of the night, I sell illusions, or more commonly, I am a prostitute. I could never walk into his house. So Givaldo called the judge and he said, listen, this is so-and-so, and I wish to speak with her today at 5 o'clock in the morning when we're done with the work. Before I travel at 7 a.m., I want to have 2 hours with her. He said, sure, no problem. But he said, but she needs to tell you what she does because she's not comfortable. When you find out, if other people find out who's in your house, she's afraid that she's going to compromise you as a judge. So hesitantly, she tells him, she says, I am a prostitute. He says, I don't care what you are. I care about what you're going to do after you spend 2 hours with him. That interests me. So they decided that she would return. 5 o'clock in the morning, Givaldo pulled up in the car with the judge and the wife, and there she was outside, quivering of the cold. She didn't have the courage to go inside and wait for them. But then she decided to go in, and she started narrating her story. She said, Givaldo, when I was 12 years old, my father died. My mother was young, pretty, and she was also very alone. She met a man whom she fell in love with, and he moved in. But when he moved in, he started making advancements at me. One night, I woke up. I was crying. And he was over me, and he was caressing me. And I made mention to scream, and he said, if you scream, I'll tell your mom that you seduced me and brought me here. So she quieted down, and he raped her. That happened many times, until one day she had the courage to tell her mother. Her mother said, I knew you were going to come with this lie to me because he had warned me that you've been trying to seduce him. And because he's not leaving me for you, you came to try to make trouble and confusion. She was 14. She said, you are no longer welcome in my house. And since you're so good at seducing, you go out in the world and seduce other married men, not mine. She was devastated. She had an inheritance, which was going to be left for her when she turned 21. And the mother didn't give her one dime. She went to live with a friend who was 16 years old and had an apartment. She had a luxurious apartment. And she was like, wow, my friend is so successful. So after a few months, her friend said, listen, you can't live here and not pay anything. You gotta work. So what kind of work do you do? She says, I accompany men at night. You know, keep them company, dine with them, drink with them. Sometimes I do something else, a little more, and I get paid a little more. She was horrified, but she didn't see it any other way, so she dove into the prostitution. She tried calling her mom a few times, but her mother didn't want to hear. She had no compassion for her daughter. One day, when she was 16, a man in his 50s walked into the place that she worked in. And these women, they're kind of like displayed first by their age and then by their look, and then choose who they want. While we judge the prostitutes, we don't pay attention to the men and women who feed that kind of action. It's pretty amazing, you know, that we resort to 2,000 years ago when the woman who committed adultery was brought before Christ, and he said, let that who is without sin cast the first stone, should be repeated nowadays, because we all have issues that we have to work at. Regardless, this man walked in and he liked her. He said, listen, I'm gonna pay for you to be with me from 7 at night until midnight every day, and I don't want any sex from you. He said, I want companionship, because you see, my wife is sick and she's not able to correspond with my needs. So she thought, this is great, I don't need to do any of the things. They started spending time together. He would pick her up, they would go to the movies, they would go to plays, they would go to operas, he would buy her nice things. Before she knew it, she was in love with him. And when he realized this, he said, listen, I know that you're in love with me. I've spent the last 4 months trying to conquer your heart, because I do want to make love to you, but only if you love me. And so they did. This part I didn't tell you. They embarked in this sexual relationship, realizing that if she said, leave your wife for me, he would. She decided that it wasn't right to do that. Thinking back about what happened in her own home and how somebody came and broke her family apart, she decided that she couldn't do that. So she decided to run away and not tell him where she was going. She went to a faraway city, and this man every Wednesday would go there, and she wasn't there. Enough time went by, 3 months. She couldn't help it. She missed him so much, and she decided to go back to the city. When she got there, she went back to the old place that she worked in, and the girls would tell her that he came for a long time every Wednesday looking for her, didn't want any other girl, and then he disappeared. So the best got the best of her. She called the house where he lived, and the butler answered the phone. He passed the phone to the wife, and the wife requested a meeting with her because this guy was really good. He was rich, he had built his wealth, and he would give to charitable organizations. So she used that as an excuse to say that she was someone that he assisted with her studies. And the woman found that to be normal because that was the character of her husband. But something about her made her like the girl. She said, I'm going to continue helping you in the name of my husband. She had no idea who this girl was. When she left the house, she was so heartbroken by the situation that she fell into heavy drug using. And that's when she decided to kill herself. She had no meaning for her life. She wanted love, she couldn't find it. Not in her family, not with any other man. And that's when she met Divaldo Franco and heard about Mary of Magdalene. Because the one thing that Mary of Magdalene wished for was the kind of love that nourished her heart, and which she couldn't find with any men because the relationships were meaningless. Like drinking a salt water when you're thirsty, it doesn't quench the thirst. And she saw herself as Mary, but she thought, my God, there is hope for me. I can turn my life around. It's going to take sacrifice. I'm going to be poor, but there is meaning for life. Life is meant to be lived fully, wholeheartedly, with love. And eventually, who knows, I may just have the family I had always hoped for. Divaldo was so touched. He said to her how proud he was to hear of her story. And the judge and the wife who were listening said, Spiritism has taught us something, that when we see an opportunity to serve, we do. We don't have any kids, and you look to be what, about 17? He said, my wife and I are willing to adopt you, put you in a program to get you out of the drugs, give you a lifestyle where you will study, where you will do something with your life. She looked for Divaldo for approval, and Divaldo went like this with his head. Divaldo was so proud of his hosts because he wasn't expecting this kind of offer that they did. So they embraced her, they took care of her, and she became a wonderful young woman. One day she wrote Divaldo. She said, Divaldo, I have met someone. And he's like, that's great. She said, yeah, but I don't know what to do. You see, I I've never courted, I've never dated. And he said, well, you already know when men get too frisky, you know how to stop them. So stop him when he gets too frisky. Date. Let him find out who you are. Fall in love. Let him love you. But tell him the truth. Tell him the truth about who you were if that concerns you. And she did. She told him the truth. He loved her for who she was. And then one day she wrote Givaldo and she said, we are getting married. The really cool thing about this, backing up a little bit, is when she was narrating the story for Givaldo, Givaldo noticed a spirit around her, crying, holding on to her, and he realized that the spirit that was holding on to her was the man in his 50s who had died. Because as the wife narrated, he had come home one day with an apparent depression so profound that the doctor said, we can only save him if he wants to live. He doesn't want to live. She said, why don't you want to live? And the man couldn't tell the wife the reason for his profound pain in the heart. So he died. Not eating, you know, all the things that people in depression usually do. So she told Givaldo that, and when Givaldo came to meet her and went to do another lecture, he saw that she was pregnant. She had the baby, and the woman, the late widow that had embraced her and loved her also and decided to keep helping her, fell in love with the baby. There was something about that baby that spoke to her so deep. It was the husband who had returned. She adopted the little baby as her godson. And the parents that adopted this girl had him as their grandson as well. She decided to call her mom. And her mother said, now you call me, you want your inheritance? She said, no, I want you. She said, well, I don't want to know about you. So she decided that that was the end of their relationship with her mother. Givaldo said that he never told her about who that little boy, whom both women loved so much, as to not interrupt the maternal care, the mother-child care that she was going to offer that child. But the one thing that was pretty profound is that with her finding the reason in the misuse, the misconduct, all of those things that brought her to her moment, one was an experience of growth, which we have to take into consideration. Every relationship, every experience, everything that we do should serve as that which gives us experience to live better. Because we're not going to stand here and say that none of us here have made mistakes, whereas the area of relationship and sex and commitment is concerned. But one of the things that we have to do is believe in a love that nourishes and feeds, that provides well-being. And remember what Emmanuel said, it's not the act itself that is unclean, but the conduct of our mind. Because we might pinpoint our fingers to people who may be having questionable lifestyles, but if we are doing that, the conduct of our mind is not healthy either. And so we have to work on that. And realizing that sex, when applied correctly between two people who love each other, it's going to strengthen them through life's trials. Commitment is necessary to maintain any relationship alive. And that goes along with doing sacrifices, of being able to turn for each other. And that's going to bring a notion of responsibility, our own responsibility within the relationship that we are in, which is pretty important for us to maintain any kind of healthy lifestyle. Our kids will see that. If we are not in a moment where we can have children, we can be parents for other kids in society. And how do we do that? We lead a good lifestyle so they too have other examples to see. This is pretty much the study that we wanted to bring here today. Just bringing about the notion of responsibility around the act of sex and being committed in a loving, interesting relationship. So with that, I'm going to open for comments, thoughts, suggestions, and questions.
Great.
Thank you.